Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to be painting the Lady of Blades from the Sylvaneth army. Now I love the look of this model, but we're going to do a little bit of modifying. I want these two vines in the front here to kind of bend in front of the model. So we're going to do that today after doing a quick little demonstration on how to manipulate one of the models using heat. And to do that I'm using a little bit of spare sprue. Now, in order to do this, you want to kind of hold it over the heat, but you don't want the flame to touch the plastic. If you do, it'll burn and you will destroy the model or the piece that you're trying to manipulate. The trick to it is just put a little bit of pressure and bend while you're holding it over the heat to allow it to kind of start bending as soon as it has a little bit of heat and a little bit of pliability. Once that's done, you let go, pull it away from the heat, blow on it a little, and let it cool. Once it's cooled, it maintains that shape. I wanted her front limbs here to kind of be like they're guarding her as she's striking forward, so that's kind of the effect that I'm going for. And I apologize for taking the model away from the camera so much, but I'm also trying to keep my cat from jumping on my desk. Once that's done, we can blow out the candle, and look at that, it looks a lot more like what I'm hoping to do. Now, we'll do a quick base coat in Wraithbone, and from there, we can go ahead and get started. Now we're going to start with some raw umber, and just kind of do a all-over coat of anything that looks like it would be wood. So these four vines coming off of her back, her arms, her legs, and her head. Now we're going to ignore the chest plate. We're going to paint that in a different color a little bit later. Now normally I would base coat a model like this that's going to be kind of tree-like in a camouflage brown that I pick up at the hardware store, but I ran out and they didn't have any in store, so I went with Wraithbone, and the raw umber will give it the same kind of rough underlay that the camouflage paint would have. Now we're going to use some burnt umber and do a kind of medium dry brush over all of the wood areas. This will kind of help to start build the layers for the texturing of the wood. Now if you ever feel that you're going a little bit too heavy with a dry brush, you can stop, and with a wet brush, just with water, you can kind of pull away some of that paint, or you can just repaint the area with the previous color, wait for it to dry, and go back and do a dry brushing. Just be cautious not to do that too much, otherwise you could start losing some detail. Once that's dry, we're going to grab some yellow ochre and use that to paint all of the little kind of armor pads on her arms and legs. But once again, we're going to ignore the chest plate. And there's this little kind of plate on her head, so we're going to paint that with the yellow as well. While that's drying, we're going to use some burnt sienna on kind of a medium light dry brush over all of the wooden sections. Be a little cautious around the wet paint. You can transfer paint this way without realizing it. Now this seems a little bright right now, but once it dries, it'll kind of dim down a little bit and really help add to the wood texturing. And now we're going to use some yellow ochre deep. This is going to dry brush over all of the wooden sections as well. Again, kind of wait for the previous dry brush to dry, but this will really help kind of add that last extra layer of wood coloration to the texture. And we're going very, very light with this dry brush, just enough to put a little paint on. And then we're going to use some red ochre, and I went a little heavy on one of the plates on this. I do go back and kind of remove some of the paint in a moment, but we're going to do a kind of medium light dry brush over the armor panels on her shoulders and legs. Then we're going to use some deep green. This is going to paint all of the leaves along her kind of tail cloak. Now, once this dries, we're going to do a dry brush on the outside, but not the underside of the model. Now, the reason we're going to do it that way is because the underside is not really going to be seen that much, so we don't really need to worry about dry brushing that area. And it'll make it look more like a shadowed section, which, given how light is going to fall on a model, is kind of what you'd want in the first place. Now we're going to use some silver, and this is going to be used to paint her chest plate as well as the shaft of her spear. Now once that's dry, we're going to grab some metallic bronze. I was originally going to do this on all of the little detail work on the chest plate, but it blends in a little too much with the silver. So instead, we're going to use it to paint some of the larger areas on the rest of the model. So the tip of the spear, the butt of the spear, and the headdress. And while we're at it, we're going to paint all of her claws coming off of her hands. Now later, off camera, I do finish those areas up with a quick dry brush of silver, just to kind of give them a little extra shine. Now we're going to use some copper. This had a much nicer contrast against the silver, so I'm using it to paint all the detail areas on her chest plate and part of her sides. And we eventually use it to paint the entire front train of her armor. Now we're going to do a little bit of touch-up with some silver, mostly just to kind of hit an area that I had completely forgotten about on the back. And while that's drying, we're going to grab some emerald green. There's a lot of little leaves on all the vines on the model, so we're going to use this to kind of do a quick touch on each of them. There are some little thorns growing as well, but I kind of wanted, instead of thorns, to kind of make it look like they were budding leaves and, you know, little plant growths. So all of the thorns also got a painting of the emerald green as well. And once that's done, we're going to follow it up with a quick dry brush of the cloak. While that's drying, we're going to grab some burnt sienna, and there's a few little kind of vines coming off of her headdress here, so we're going to paint those in the burnt sienna just to give them a little bit of a pop-out contrast compared to the rest of the model. This will draw attention to this area and kind of give it a little bit of a different coloration from the rest of the piece. Now we're going to grab some orc flesh contrast, and we're going to use it to paint the orc that she is standing on. I love the idea that, she's kind of crushing this orc into the ground and turning him into a bush or a tree. So we're going to paint some vines on him in a moment. And switching back to the copper, now that this back section is dry, we're going to do the little detail work that we missed before. And now we're going to use a little bit of Wraithbone. There's a couple of skulls and a little bit of touch-up areas that we kind of want to go over, so we're going to use this to kind of remove any other paint from those areas so that we can paint them proper in a minute. Now we're going to use some silver to kind of give some detail work to the bottle that's kind of growing out of her back. And now we're going to use some Aethermatic Blue. This is going to be used to paint the wings of the two little dragonflies that are kind of riding along with her. There's one on her cloak and then one coming off one of the vines. Now we're going to use some yellow ochre. This is going to be used to paint the body of the dragonflies, kind of give them a little bit of a standout. Now we're going to use some null oil. This is going to go over the cloak of leaves as well as the spear. And then we're also going to hit the little dragonflies to kind of give them some definition, and all of the silver on her chest plate and the little bottle growing on her back. This will help bring some definition out and kind of highlight the crevices. Now we're going to use some Agrax Earthshade, and this is going to go over all of the wooden sections. So be a little cautious if you do this. Make sure that you're either waiting for the null oil to dry, or you're being careful not to mix the two colors together, because that does happen a lot easier than you'd expect. And by this point, the null oil on the cloak is dried, and I wanted a little bit more earthy tone to the cloak, so we went over it real quick with some Earthshade. Once that's done, we're going to go back to the burnt sienna and use it to just kind of highlight all these little viney sections growing around the orc on the ground. Now we're going to use some skeleton horde and just do a quick touch on the skulls. Now that the model is finished being painted, we're going to use some wood glue, which I'm going to spread around with a toothpick. I'm doing a fairly liberal application coating the entire base of the model. Once the base is coated, we're going to use some mixed grit play sand, which I got at my local hardware store, and just coat the base, and once the glue dries, we tap off any extra, and we will have a fully based and painted model. And here we are with the finished piece. This was a very unique model, and I loved being able to show how I could manipulate the model and kind of do kit bashing without using extra pieces for you guys. So please hit that like button, subscribe for future content, comment in the comment section. I do reply to all comments, so let me know how I'm doing, and we will see you next episode.